The wind carried dust across the desolate stretch of Dry Creek, whistling through the sun-bleached boards of the saloon porch and rattling the shutters of buildings that had seen better days, a place of grit and endurance where men bent their backs beneath the sky and the earth took more than it gave. But in that unforgiving corner of the West, something had stirred, a hope so rare it almost felt dangerous, for letters had gone out across the rails, carried by the hands of postman and train conductors, words scribbled by lonely ranchers whose days were filled with cattle and silence and whose nights ended staring at empty walls, letters asking strangers to come west, to leave the safety of cities, to travel into this dust-choked wilderness and stand as wives beside men hardened by sun and toil. And when the word spread that 3 brides had indeed agreed, 3 women who would make the journey, there was a change in the air of Dry Creek, a murmur of excitement weaving its way through poker games and whiskey glasses, men polishing boots, patching shirts, oiling guns, not because they expected trouble but because some instinct told them that the world was shifting, that soon laughter might ring in kitchens instead of only in saloons, that maybe even the hardest life could be softened by the gentleness of a woman's hand. And yet no man in Dry Creek could have foreseen the horror that awaited them on the morning those women were due to arrive. No one imagined that instead of bridal smiles and hopeful voices there would be silence, choking silence broken only by the creak of ropes swaying in the wind, for when dawn painted the sky in hues of copper and crimson, a riderless horse bolted through town, foam flecking its mouth, reins flapping wild, and before questions could form on dry lips someone cried from the north gate, and the men, ranchers and gamblers and even the sheriff himself, hurried there with boots thudding against the packed dirt, their shadows long in the rising light, and what they saw froze blood in veins. 3 women, their dresses once bright with the promise of new beginnings now torn and stained, hanging lifeless from the wooden arch of the gate, their bodies swaying in grim rhythm to the desert wind, eyes closed forever to the futures they had crossed miles to find, and on the rough wood a note, scrawled with jagged letters that bled fury. This is what awaits those who bring strangers here, a warning nailed with rust and spite, and the crowd that gathered fell into silence so deep that even the flies buzzing around the lifeless form sounded like thunder, for these were not nameless corpses, these were brides, women who had left everything behind for a chance at love, for the promise of partnership, women who had ridden back to lonely ranchers with hopeful words, perhaps shaky with fear but steady with determination, women who now dangled as an example, as a message, as a threat, and in that silence Sheriff Elijah Kane stepped forward, his weathered face carved deeper by the weight of years and responsibility, his hand on the worn grip of his Colt, eyes narrowing as if he could burn the message into memory and hunt down the hands that wrote it, while around him the ranchers, men who had fought Apaches, chased rustlers, and braved storms that could strip a man's skin raw, now stood motionless, shaken to the marrow. Because they had dreamed of these women, had whispered their names in the dark, had cleaned their homes and mended fences in anticipation, and now hope was dangling before them on 3 ropes, a grotesque mockery of every letter sent, every dollar spent, every prayer whispered, and for a moment Dry Creek felt cursed by the land itself or by enemies unseen, and one rancher, Samuel Tiller, dropped to his knees, his hat falling into the dirt as he clawed the ground with hands rough from years of ranch work, tears carving pale trails through the dust on his face as he whispered a name no one else heard, while another, Jack Monroe, spat hard into the dirt, a curse twisting from his lips, not at God but at the cowards who had done this, and the sheriff finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a gavel, "This ain't random. This is a message, and by the soil we stand on, I swear we'll find who did this." Yet beneath his vow lingered doubt, for the sheriff had seen enough of the West to know that sometimes vengeance was swallowed by the land, sometimes justice never came, and the ranchers of Dry Creek, standing with fists clenched and jaws set, knew that what had been stolen was more than just 3 lives. It was trust, it was hope, it was the fragile belief that even in a world of dust and blood something good could grow, and as the sun climbed higher, painting the land in unforgiving light, the body swayed, shadows stretching long like black fingers pointing toward a reckoning yet to come, for the West had many rules, unwritten but ironclad. You could steal a man's cattle, you could even shoot him dead in the dust of Main Street if you faced him square, but to kill women who came unarmed and hopeful, was to stir a fury deeper than blood, and that fury now burned in the hearts of Dry Creek's men, not loud, not shouted, but smoldering, waiting, for someone out there, whether outlaw gang or rival ranchers or enemies from across the border, had chosen to send their message in the cruelest way possible, and Dry Creek would answer, though how and when none could yet say. Only that the day which began with expectation of laughter had instead birthed a silence that would echo across the valley like a funeral bell, and in that silence began the story of blood, vengeance, and a cursed promise that no man in Dry Creek would ever forget. The townsfolk lingered at the north gate long after the sheriff had ordered the bodies cut down, no man daring to look too long at the lifeless faces, yet no one able to turn away completely, for horror holds the eyes as tightly as beauty, and even as the sheriff and 2 deputies worked silently with knives to free the ropes, every rancher stood in grim stillness, hats clutched in their hands, shoulders stooped under the weight of guilt and rage, because each man believed in some way that he had failed, that those women had been their responsibility, their protection, their promise, and the betrayal of that promise cut deep, so deep that when the undertaker finally arrived with his wagon and blankets to cover the bodies, the hush that fell over the gathered crowd was like a funeral without words, only the shuffle of boots in dirt and the low groan of wagon wheels breaking the silence. And as the grim procession rolled toward town, the sheriff stayed behind, staring at the gate, at the crude scrawl still nailed to the wood, and he muttered low so only the wind could hear, "This ain't over, not by a long shot," then turned his horse toward the saloon where the men were already gathering, because men in grief turn to whiskey as surely as iron turns to rust, but beneath that thirst was a need for answers. And when Sheriff Elijah Kane pushed through the batwing doors, the saloon was packed tight with every rancher and drifter who had been waiting for a bride, their faces red from sun and fury, eyes dark with questions, and the sheriff took the floor without waiting for quiet because he knew quiet would not come on its own. He spoke with the gravel of a man who had seen gunfights and lynch mobs. "Whoever did this wants us scared, wants us broken, but I'll tell you here and now. Dry Creek don't break, not today, not ever." Yet even as his words rumbled across the smoke-filled room he could feel the doubt, the whispers, the unspoken fear that maybe the town had been marked, maybe some powerful hand had decided to choke it out before it could grow. For rumors had been stirring in the valley, whispers of an outlaw band riding the mesas, a gang without mercy led by a man called Caleb Vance. A name spoken in fear by those who knew it, a man who had no code, who slaughtered settlers, raided ranches, and strung up lawmen as warnings, and though no one spoke his name in the saloon that night, the thought of him pressed into every corner like a shadow, until finally Jack Monroe slammed his fist on the table, rattling glasses, his face twisted in fury. "What are we waitin' for, Sheriff? We saddle up, ride hard, and find the devils who did this, hang them just the same." But Samuel Tiller, still pale from tears shed at the gate, shook his head slow, his voice trembling yet strong. "We ride blind, Jack, we'll end up hangin' beside them women if we go chasin' shadows," and a murmur ran through the room because Samuel spoke truth. The West was wide and merciless, and vengeance without direction was death, yet the hunger for action gnawed at every belly, and the sheriff, knowing he had to give the men more than waiting, leaned on the bar, his voice low, steady. "We ain't ridin' blind. We're ridin' smart. I'll send word down the line, ask the stage master, the rail conductor, anyone who saw 3 women travel west, where they stopped, who rode near. We'll piece it together, step by step, and when we find the men who did this, you got my word they'll wish they never set foot in this valley." And though the words cooled some of the fire, the ranchers left the saloon in knots of quiet talk, suspicion already circling like vultures, some whispering that maybe it wasn't outlaws at all, maybe rival ranchers who didn't want strangers coming in, maybe Comanche or Apache bands still bitter over lost land, maybe even someone within Dry Creek itself, and that suspicion, once born, would not easily die, it would fester and grow, for trust in the West was a fragile thing, brittle as old bone, and once cracked it seldom healed. So as night fell heavy and stars cut sharp above the desert,